Right, so this is from chapter 1 of Ghost Story. There were red signs standing like guards amongst the rocks, but there were no adults in sight to make him read the warnings. He waved briefly to Henry, confident that his brother wouldn't give him away, so long as John didn't reveal Henry's own plan to catch an octopus to keep in the bathtub at home. The rocks were sharp and slippery, a recent fall from the cliffs that had yet to be worn smooth by the tide. There was no obvious path up that John could see, but he was strong and he was fast on his feet. He felt sure he could cross them easily. His confidence served him well until he was almost reached the nearest shadow. It was a cave just as he'd hoped, with an entrance large enough for a small boy of 10 to walk into it without stooping. Unfortunately, the large flat rock sitting just inside was perfectly balanced to send a boy like him tumbling backwards towards the jagged stones below. A voice shouted, "On your left." Moving without any conscious instructions from his brain, John's left hand reached out and grabbed the tuft of samphire growing from the cliff face. It wasn't much of a handhold, but it was enough to change his balance. John threw himself forward into the cave, laughing from the shock as he landed with a squelch on the stones. He wasn't hurt. What an adventure. But the cave smelled terrible, a horrid, rotten odour that John put down to the thick, slippery layer of seaweed underfoot. He sat up, determined to get his face away from the smell, and then gasped at the sight above him. He'd heard stories about cave paintings before, but he never thought he would see them for real. But there, 4 feet up the wall of the cave entrance, was a series of small, dark brown handprints. And besides the handprints, a boy stood watching him. "You nearly had a nasty fall," he said, with a chilling kind of conviction that almost distracted John from his wonder. "You should be more careful." "Oh, I will be. Thanks for the help." The boy nodded as he looked towards the mouth of the cave. "It took me a while to notice the plants when I came here. Didn't want you to go the same way." John nodded vaguely. He didn't really know what to say next, so he tried to use those good manners that his mother was always trying to remind him about. "I'm John," he said, holding out his hand. Instead of shaking it, the boy just looked at him. Outside, the distant sound of waves and gulls made the silence all the more uncomfortable. "Matthew," he replied at last, as if he didn't remember the word until then. John swallowed and wondered what else to say. He didn't usually have trouble making friends, but something about Matthew made him uneasy. "How long have you been coming here?" he asked. Maybe the boy was going to show him around. "I found the entrance last week," Matthew said. Suddenly he smiled. "There's a hidden pool back there. Do you want to see?" The tunnels were dark, but they began to climb after a few meters, just enough to be dry and sandy instead of disgustingly wet. Matthew chattered away behind him, describing the various fish and crabs he'd found in the pool. His new companion seemed so confident that John didn't notice the deepening shadows, until he realised he wasn't sure he would spot the pool before he was stepping into it. He was starting to worry more and more about his footing in the dark, about the spiders and the other things that could be hiding there, about being trapped, when they finally stepped into a large open space. High above, John could see small grass-fringed holes in the ceiling of the cave, probably leading out onto the fields above the cliffs. Shafts of light streamed down to glitter on the slightly rippling surface of the water. John bent down and touched it, shivering a little at the chill after the bright sun outside. The pool was massive, and while the foul smell lingered, it didn't seem to be coming from the water. It was fresh water, not salt water. The sunburn on his back stung as he straightened up, and the pain made this decision for him. Grinning back at Matthew, he half jumped, half flopped into the water, gasping at the sudden temperature change. Matthew smiled happily and dove in after him. John had rarely had so much fun in his life, even during those dimly remembered holidays in Florida. Free from the watchful eyes of adults, he and Matthew played all the dangerous games they could imagine, leaping from high rocks and diving under the water surface. The only rule they had was to avoid the far shore, where the light didn't quite reach and the awful smell seemed to be strongest. Matthew was reluctant to go over there. John didn't blame him. Why leave the pleasant side of the pool and have to breathe in that smell all day? As the winds picked up outside, whistling and moaning through the holes above them and sending the occasional splatter of rain down on their heads, John failed to hear his brother shouting. He'd left his watch, a treasured bright green swatch, by the side of the pool and didn't remember to check it until he heard a rumble of thunder and a voice that sounded eerily like his mother calling for him. He turned to Matthew to ask if the other boy heard the voice too, but his companion had gone. The sky had darkened with this sudden summer storm, so that John could barely see his way around the cave. The water was still, and he could hear only his own breathing below the storm. A flash of lightning lit up the space just for an instant, and John saw Matthew at last. He was sitting on the other bank with his back to the wall, watching him. John was about to call out to him when he heard the voice outside screaming his name again. It was definitely his mother, and she did not sound happy. Perhaps Matthew was scared of the storm, or maybe he just didn't want to face an angry adult. Either way, the boy knew the caves better than John did, and John didn't dare leave his mother waiting a moment longer. So John waved and promised to be back tomorrow and went on his way. He never did get back to the caves tomorrow. Instead, that night, when they should have been in bed, John had sat on the floor by the bedroom door, trying to eavesdrop on his mother and the two police officers sitting solemnly in the living room. But he fell asleep again with his face against the door frame without hearing a single word that he could understand. And that's the end of that extract. And if you'd like to find out more about John and how he meets Sherlock, then you can check out the book, which is Ghost Story by Improbable Press.